introduce me. I'm Jerry Brown. I'm a retired social studies teacher from Perry Meridian. Social studies, I've loved history. I'm not a native South Sider, but I moved here in 1974 and started teaching at Perry Meridian High School, which was the second year that Perry Meridian was open. And I like sports history. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to do the basketball team. And I suggested the Kautsky program. And if you like the program tonight, come up and see me. If you didn't like it, Barry will be glad to meet with you. I want to give credit to some of my friends who helped me, who are native Southsiders and they're into sports history. Dave Schaefer, who's not here tonight. Rick Schaefer, raise your hand, Rick. Dave's brother. Dick Chu, raise your hand, Dick. Ron Bolliard, some of you may remember from his days in the school district. And my son-in-law back here, Joe Ake, who's doing the filming. And his wife, our daughter Melanie Ake, next to him in the green. And my wife, Joyce, back there in the blue and white. So. I did draw a lot from the book, not exclusively, but I blended the information from the guys I just mentioned. I did call the author of the book. I wanted to make sure it was okay. And he said, no problem. However, I'm asking you, no, I'm begging you, do not use anything for a money-making purpose, okay? Whatever you share, do it with the private group, but don't try to profit from anything that's been presented tonight. Okay? All right. I did want to mention, it was mentioned previously, Frank sponsored a baseball team, okay? I could not find anything on it, but I didn't pursue it really hard because I wanted to concentrate on the basketball team. But here's a picture of the Indianapolis Kautskys and Barry. It's on the screen. Oh, all right, good. I'm thinking, as old as this was, does this look like the front of Edgewood or something else?
Maybe the front of the old South portion.
Oh, okay.
Where Chase Bank is.
Oh, yes, okay. You might be right on that. You might well be right. Well, anyway, I could not find anything about the Kautsky baseball team, and I wanted to concentrate on the basketball team anyway, so I didn't really pursue it. But if somebody knows something about it and you want to mention it tonight, great, okay? Really, the key to the beginning of the Kautsky team was the friendship that developed between Frank and a guy that a lot of you, I think, will recognize, Pete Bailey. Okay. Oh, there you go. I can't forget you've got this in. All right. Frank knew that Pete was a good basketball player, but he really didn't know too much about basketball. So Pete said, "Come on, Frank, down to Edgewood Grade School. Going to have a pickup game. Admission's a nickel." Okay. Now this is 1931. Okay. Even a nickel in the Depression was valuable. Mm-hmm. So Frank went to the game. Well, he fell in love with it immediately. Okay. And afterwards, he asked Pete to start organizing a team of players that he would sponsor, and they would be called the Kautsky ACs. Okay. Now, the AC stood for Athletic Club. Okay. So it really didn't have like a mascot like a lot of teams have, but it was just the Kautsky Athletic Club. The first year, they were an independent club, which meant they basically played anybody that would play them. Okay. And Pete got his brother to play for the team, plus some Indiana Central graduates and some IU graduates. And I'll mention some of those in a little bit. On game nights, this was just mentioned, but I'll go over it again. On game nights, Frank drove his big Chrysler to the game sites. The players would ride in the car, but the friends and family would ride in the delivery truck. And that's where they sat on the milk crates, and can imagine back then in the winter and bouncing up and down, and it had to be a real pleasurable trip to the games. But they were probably grateful to get to go, so I'm not going to demean them. Frank used a lot of promotions. Remember, Depression, okay? They needed to get people in, and that's when baseball developed the doubleheaders. They thought if we charge one price for 2 games, people were more likely to come. Well, he knew what he needed to do. So one promotion was that they would give out 2 turkeys every game. Okay? So your game ticket was a chance to win a turkey. Another one, I like this one. They also would play against barnstorming women's teams. Didn't even think they probably existed back then, but they did. The Hoosier Demons and the Real Silk Girls Club. Okay. In early February of '32, they entered the Central States basketball tournament, and they won it. Now they're still amateurs at this point. Okay. They defeated a team named Bond Bread. You know, back in these days, there wasn't the big money people didn't really sponsor these. It was local people back at the beginning. Bond Bread. I looked at Bond Bread, and I think they originated in Philadelphia. Well, they defeated them, and then the next year they became professional. When they turned professional, Frank hired Abe Goldsmith. Abe Goldsmith was a local sporting goods store owner who sold a lot of basketball-related equipment. So he was kind of a natural to get involved with, and he became the business manager. And he would sell the tickets, okay, he'd help promote the games. So he did a lot on the business side for Frank. Ticket prices, 40 cents for reserved seats, 25 cents for general admission. Now the normal price back then I read was $1 a game. Frank's thinking was, I want to just get more people. So I'm only going to charge 40 cents. And again, of course, once you're in there, what are you going to buy? Concessions. You know? So and stuff, and I'm sure Frank got a cut out of that. Maybe he even supplied some of it, I don't know. But that really helped promote the Kautsky team. Those early years, this was mentioned a little while ago, Frank never made a cent. And an Indianapolis newspaper reporter asked him for a story. Frank, why do you continue to support a team that doesn't make any money? Frank's answer, I just like to see him play. My kind of man. Okay? Many times they played their games at the Armory on North Pennsylvania Street. But as they grew more popular, they started having some games at Hinkle. Hinkle, I found out reading this, that was a big draw during this era for all teams because it was big and they could get more fans in. That really helped the Kautskys, I think, through the years because that was the big draw, or one of the big draws. Apparently, Frank could get pretty emotional during the games. One account that I read said he rarely sat on the bench. Instead, he straddled the atmosphere above the bench. Okay? He lives and dies with every missed basketball or missed pass. When he forgets and wears his hat to a game, it is a sad article once the game is over. He will stretch it, pound it, and on occasion throw it down and stomp on it. If Frank got upset with the player, he might just go right out on the court and start yelling at him, right during the game. The players didn't think anything about it because in their minds, he's paying the bills. He can say and do what he wants to. Okay, so they didn't really have a problem with it. Frank soon realized he needed a superstar, somebody though that would draw people in to make them want to come back after they had watched maybe a game. Well, he found his man, John Wooden. Okay, and John Wooden, of course, gained fame first at Martinsville High School, leading them to state championships. Then he went to Purdue, where he was a star, helped lead them to conference titles. And he was the perfect character guy for Frank. John Wooden was a devout Christian. He was a clean-cut guy. I've read that he was one of the most hard-nosed players ever on the court. And that he was just a natural leader. So, you know, who wouldn't want a guy on your team, okay? So he talked to John. Well, John initially did not want to play. Some things in an intro. One, they played a lot of their games on Sundays. Being a devout Christian, John had a problem with that. Okay? Sunday afternoons were typical back in those days. You know, no NFL, no TV. In the wintertime, they were looking for something to do. Okay? Most of us in the room can remember stores were closed on Sundays. There wasn't a lot of other competition for the buck back in those days. So Sundays was a very typical day to have a game. So that was one reason. Another reason was that keep in mind the travel conditions back then. Okay, no interstates. Okay, they traveled state highways in the middle of the winter. Probably had to get onto county roads to go to some of these places. Snow plowing equipment was probably minimal. Those weren't fun trips. Okay, I mean, as far as getting there and back. John also was living in Dayton, Ohio at the time. And so he'd have to drive from Dayton just to get, if the game was in Indianapolis. If it was played out of town, then that was just even more mileage. He did play, the free throw accuracy. This is a great story. John Wooden was a great free throw shooter. He had hit 99 in a row. Well, Frank was at the game. Wooden hits 100. Frank jumps out of the stands and runs around the court and gives Wooden a $100 bill. $100 in the Depression. Okay? All right? Here's the best part of the story. As soon as his wife sees it, she runs out of the court and grabs it out of his hands. John said, I guess I knew where that money was going to go. I just think that's a great story. Great story. John played for the team for about 10 years. Toward the end, it was kind of off and on. He got out, I think, for several reasons. One of the big ones was the travel. You know, it would just, that would be hard on him. Plus, he described a typical road trip. They would get up on Saturday, drive to a place like Sheboygan. Okay, no interstates. Yeah, Sheboygan. Play a game on Saturday, spend the night, drive up to Oshkosh for a Sunday game, okay, and then drive back home. Now, all the guys on the Kautsky team back then, they had regular jobs. I mean, they did make enough money playing basketball to support a team or a family. So they all had Monday jobs. Well, by the time they finished the game on Sunday, I was a good guy, took their shower and so on, drove back home. John was getting back to Dayton at like 6 o'clock in the morning. Well, he had to go teach, you know, and he'd maybe not up all night helping to drive, but a lot of it. That would wear on you. Okay, I mean, that would wear on you. So I think that was a big part, the treacherous driving conditions. Plus, I think he wanted to devote more time to his coaching. Because he at Dayton, then he eventually went up to South Bend Central, and then he was at Indiana State for a couple of years, and then he went to UCLA, and that's where we get to know him and fund him. You know, probably the greatest college coach ever. 10 national championships in 12 years, 7 in a row from 1967 to 1973. But I think Indy can take pride, the Kautsky can take pride that John Wooden played for their team. And that's really significant. Okay. Frank and another Indianapolis guy, not Indianapolis, but another owner decided to form a new league. Paul Sheets was the guy, and he was with Firestone Tire and Rubber in Akron. Both of them were pretty shrewd businessmen, and they felt a league that had the best teams from around the Midwest would draw a lot of fans. So they called the league the National Basketball League, not the National Basketball Association we know today, the National Basketball League. The original members were the Kautskys, the Akron Goodyears, the Akron Firestones. They must have liked basketball in Akron. The Toledo Crimson, the Lorain Ohio Fisher Foods, Fort Wayne Chiefs, Kokomo Celts, South Bend Guardsmen, and the Muncie Whips. Apparently the Kautsky team and the Firestone team, they were the class of that league. On that team, when they started turning professional, a few of the names were Clarence Big Chris Christopher from Butler at 6'7". Charles Stretch Murphy from Purdue at 6'7". I'll talk about him more lately. Oh, there he is. That's a big picture Stretch. There's a great story behind him related to where he grew up in Marion. And Frank Baird from Butler. Now, Frank Baird, some of you might know him. He was a longtime coach here in Indianapolis, refereed basketball and football games for years and years. That's how I knew the name, was what he was still refereeing when I first moved to Indy. here was something I thought was pretty good too. Frank and Paul, whether motivated out of enlightenment or motivated out of money, or maybe both, they played all black teams. And two of them were this surprised me, it was called the New York Celtics. So I'm thinking maybe they started in New York rather than in Boston. That was one of the teams. The next one I'm going to mention, you'll recognize, the Harlem Globetrotters. Okay. Now, I don't know back then whether they were serious basketball or whether it was the clown kind of game. That
They were serious. They were serious.
were they? Okay. All right. Well, I trust you. Yeah. Okay. And the New York Renaissance, or the Wrens, that back then they were referred to as the colored teams are going to be coming to play. But why I think the money, they drew big crowds at Hinkle, whatever those teams came to play, because they were good and they always give the Kautsky team a battle. And so I think people, they wanted to see it as much for the basketball as anything else. So, but I thought, that's 30 years before the civil rights, that they were willing to play teams like that. Yeah. I'll give you an example of the Wrens. The Wrens at one point had a record of 478 wins and 67 losses, spread over several seasons. But listen to this one. One season they won 120 games and lost 8. Now, that barnstorming travel wasn't easy either. So, but they probably took on anybody that was willing to play. But that's amazing to me. 120 wins, 8 losses. Wow. Okay. During this time, there were some other local teams. I didn't really do too much with them because I tried to concentrate on the Kautskys. The Indianapolis Emeralds that was sponsored by the sporting goods store. Okay. There was the Indianapolis Continental Tire team. Here's some names from Emerald. Al Feeney, he would eventually become the mayor of Indianapolis. Ward Piggy Lambert, longtime coach up at Purdue. He played at Purdue, and then he was the coach there. And Homer Stonebreaker. Anybody know who Homer Stonebreaker was? Tell us. Wingate. They won the first state. They won the first 2 state high school championships. And he went to Purdue. And so those were 3 of the players on the Emeralds team. Another new league started in 1935, the Midwest Basketball League. Also during this time, a big rule change happened in basketball. I can kind of remember the old guys talking about this when I was growing up. Back in the old days, they had the center jump after every basket. So instead of the other team taking it out of bounds and running down the court, they all met it at the center circle, and they jumped it up again. Yeah. Now, John Wood was quoted as saying, "I wish they'd have had that my whole career," because he was one of these guys who was up and down the court. But that slowed the pace down, obviously. When you're going to have a center jump. Well, they eliminated that, and that really sped the game up. And I think it probably made it. Well, I know it would have made it much more attractive to fans to watch. So that was a big thing to kind of help basketball. It was also during this era that Frank did a lot of philanthropy work. He often invited children from the orphans' home or the newspaper carriers to enjoy games free of charge. Steve, I think you said he sponsored Pony League teams back in the day. So, yeah.
Yeah, they both did.
Both of them?
Kautsky both, yes.
Okay.
For years. They wouldn't sponsor my team, but then
Is that another discussion? Okay. Also during this time, a guy had a team, which a lot of you native Southsiders would recognize, Jewel Young.
Yep.
He had the Jewel Young All-American team. Now, I do not believe they were in the same league with the Kautskys. But, back in those days, things were pretty loose, there would be independent leagues. Teams could come and go on a whim, the owner-sponsor ran out of money, that kind of thing. So there were probably a lot of those teams around. This is the Jewel Young team. They barnstormed around the Midwest, most likely playing any teams who would play them. John Wooden retired during that era. He retired in the late 30s there. But Frank, he got a couple more good guys. I know the first, well, actually, I've heard both of these names, but I didn't know that much about them. Bob Dietz from Butler and Paul Curly Armstrong from IU. They were really good players back in the day, and they played for Kautsky. I'm going to test your history coming up here. The 1941-2 season looked really promising. They were undefeated through December, to the beginning of December. Played a game on December 6th and won. They played a game the next day and won. Then what happened? Oh, come on. You're all going to go back to high school. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, okay? Well, that just decimated the league because the guys either volunteered or they got drafted. And so Kautsky's team limped through the rest of that season, but then he shut it down because there just weren't any guys to play. You know, they were in the service. So he did not have a team through that time period. Basketball, professional basketball in Indiana might have gone forever if it wasn't for one guy. Now, it wasn't Frank Kautsky, although he was important. There was a guy out of Fort Wayne. He was rich. Flamboyant. Zollner. Yeah. Zollner had a team in Fort Wayne. Fred Zollner, he owned a very successful company, the Zollner Machine Works and Pistons. Recognize that last name? That team would eventually go to Detroit. It becomes the Detroit Pistons. Yeah. But he really, I think, saved the league because first of all, some of the guys in his plant convinced him to start a team. Well, he liked it just like Frank did. And so he sponsored a team, and he donated, from what I read, lots of money just to keep the league going as an organization during World War II. It could have folded completely, but I think it was the Zollner money that kept it going. Frank re-entered the league in November of 1945, but his team really struggled. You know, he didn't have very many returning players. A lot of those guys probably went to the service. You know, their skills had eroded, plus they took advantage, just like my dad did. They got the GI Bill, and they could go to college now. You know, and so I'm going to take advantage of that. And basketball's, you know, it's going to be secondary to getting that college education. So I think that's probably why he struggled. He did get another great player. His name was Arnie Rice. And I am going to read a little bit out of the book. I don't want to read just lots of passages because that can be boring. But I'll tell you about Arnie. The Grocer's biggest triumph then after the war came in when he got former Ohio State University standout Arnie Rice, 6'9". That would have been a giant back in the day. Okay. The junior had been a dominant inside force in the Big Ten in the 45-6 season and promised in the next year was going to be his greatest. Poor grades prevented him from completing his third year with the Buckeyes. Back then, freshmen didn't play. As soon as that became apparent, his poor grades, he dropped out. And several professional coaches and team owners took great interest. Sheboygan was very interested in him as a center, and they attempted to get to him, but Paul Kautsky and Goldsmith outbid him, and Risen signed with the Kautskys. I like this next part. Don Kautsky. My dad offered to pay Risen $75 a game. I thought to myself, my goodness, Pop must have lost his marbles. How is he going to pay someone that kind of money? Now, by then, the reserve seats were $1.50 and balcony seats were 65 cents. We didn't charge very much. I don't know how we were going to pay this guy and keep the rest of the team on the payroll. But it was smart because, you know, back then the primary promotion news about players was what? Print, maybe radio. Well, there was all kinds of stories about this guy. So people wanted to come and see him play. But Risen's presence made an instant impact at the box office. At the grocery store, at the counter, 17-year-old Don, who ran the store while Frank managed the team, reported soon after they signed Rosin, they got $10,000 more per op. So he was a drawing card. He comes up later in the story in a sad way. Okay. But 46-17, that was going to be the good one. Kautsky teams were always very competitive, but they had not won a championship since the state amateur championship in '32. And so I think Frank really was really hoping to get one. They went to what was called the Chicago World Tournament, which was invitational only back in those days. And they took college teams, they took Barnstormers, they took a lot of teams. Okay? Well, they got to the final game and they defeated the Toledo Jeeps to win the game. Frank had his long-awaited championship. After the game was over, there was a wild celebration on the court. I like what Frank said to the reporter. The reporter asked Frank's reaction on winning the championship. All Frank could say was, "God bless everyone." I love it. That was the high point. After that, things began to unravel. The summer of '47 was a chaotic one for both the Basketball Association of America and the National Basketball League. There was a rival team that started up, the BAA. This was made up primarily of teams from the big cities, New York, Philly, Boston. Interesting how they got started. Back in those early days, they had the big places, Boston Garden, Madison Square Garden, but they were only used for hockey, the NHL. Those owners began, we've got this great facility that's only being used maybe every other third night during the season. Let's start a basketball team. Or a basketball, that's what they did. Okay. And now the Kautskys were not a part of it initially. Okay. And so they were still in the NBL. But the next year there was a mini absorption by the BAA and the NBL. Only 4 teams from the NBL would get absorbed. Well, the Kautskys were one of those. The Rochester Royals, which became the Cincinnati Royals, which became the Kansas City Kings, which become the Sacramento Kings that exist today. Don't ask me how I know this. Joyce bugs her. I have to bring this stuff up. Anyway, the Minneapolis Lakers, their big draw was George Mikan, the big man. Yeah. And let's see here, the Fort Wayne Pistons. But here's why they dropped the name Zollner. When they went into that BAA, no corporate sponsorship could be in the name. It had to be the city. And so the Fort Wayne team, the Zollner Pistons, became the Fort Wayne Pistons. And I can't remember what I think the Lakers were sponsored by somebody too, and then they became the Minneapolis Lakers. At this time, though, things were going on, and Frank decided to get out of basketball. He was quoted as saying, "The game's getting too fast for me." Now, when he meant fast, he didn't mean the players. He meant the rising salaries and the competition for players. And when you start getting teams that are based in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, that's hard for Indianapolis to compete. Well, it still is today, actually. I mean, the Pacers are one of the smaller markets, so that really hasn't changed. But it was really hard back then. So Frank decided to get out, and he sold all his interest to a guy by the name of Paul Walk. Mm-hmm. The team was getting cash strapped. Walk sold off Rison to the Royals. Now, you can imagine how happy that made the fan base. Star player for cash. He sold another star player for cash. What I've read, Walk was not much of a people person. He also tried to do something that I suspect had happened a lot back then. And I want to preface this by saying, in reading the book, Frank Kautsky was very much honored and respected around the league because he honored his players' contracts. He didn't try to chisel them, or not hold them up. But Frank always did that. Walk, not so much. Okay. He was known for trying to chisel guys out of some of the contract money, and the worst example was he tried to chisel all the players that had played in that '47 championship game out of their winnings. Horrible. Anyway, I said when they did go in with the BAA the second year, they had to change their name. And so Walk owned them at that time. And you couldn't have Kautsky anymore. So it had to be Indianapolis something. So he held a contest and let the fans choose what the name would be. Well, the Jets won out. Okay? So they became the Indianapolis Jets. They only lasted 1 year, and that 1 year was a pretty sad situation. They started off fairly decently, but things turned sour pretty quickly. All kinds of inner turmoil happened. A lack of money, Walk's controversial personality, player moves led to the collapse. I want to read the story of the last game. Indianapolis Jets last season was a woeful 1842, dead last in the league. In the final game at Butler Fieldhouse, Hinkle as we know it, was a pitiful microcosm of what happened that year. The Indianapolis News reported continual yipping went on between the coaches and players, with a goodly supply of swearing easily audible from the fans that were there. The officials called 7 personal fouls in the first minute. You wonder what kind of style of play that was, okay? This part is the next part I like. The frustration level rose so high that one player even threw the ball at the referee, Frank Scanlon, and then went and punched him in the face. Midway through the game, the head coach, Bert Friddle, got so upset he went into the stands to challenge a fan to a fight. It was pure pandemonium, according to the game. At the conclusion of the game, Walk turned on his heel and stormed off the court. It was his exit not only from the gym, but also from the game. He and the Indianapolis Jets never returned to the ranks of pro basketball. Now, the BAA that was left, and the NBL had one more final merger in 1949. That became the NBA that we know today. Okay. Kautsky's or the Jets weren't even issued an invitation to join them. I suspect for 2 reasons. One, they were on financial problems, inner turmoil. Plus, a team was granted a franchise that ended up having a rather infamous history. They awarded a franchise in the NBA to the Indianapolis Olympians. Right. And they were point shaving, which means they took bribes to miss baskets, and, so the gamblers would win. But that didn't come out right away. But the people in Indianapolis were actually, I think, pretty happy because those guys back then, there were 4 guys from that Kentucky team that made up the original Olympians roster. And so they had also all, I think, been together and won the 1948 Olympics. That's why they chose Olympians, was because that team won the 48. Well, the point shaving comes out and the scandal comes out, and then the league censors them, and the Olympians faded away. So they only existed about 4 years. And then we didn't have professional basketball in Indianapolis again until the Pacers. When I talked to the author, it was amazing when I talked to the author yesterday. All I was wanting to get is it okay if I use it? He goes on about the Kautsky. That's the best story you'll ever know. He starts all this. And I said, yeah, I'm kind of getting to know about it. He said, I just think it's amazing. It's a little grocery store sponsored a competitive team. I said, yeah. And he did tell me this, before I forget. This September at the Indianapolis Historical Society, they're going to have a feature exhibit on the pioneers of the hardwood, based on this book. So I would encourage you to go down and see that. I will probably be first person in line. That's all I have. Thank you.